Welcome back, everybody. We're going to be continuing on with this discussion of personality. But in the second half, we're going to be, as I mentioned in the last half of class, transitioning from the research and discussions on what causes personality into how we can articulate personality and differentiate people nowadays. And to discuss this idea, one of the first things I want to do is actually revisit the definition of personality. Namely, when we're talking about personality, we want to remind ourselves of is we're looking for consistency. So what you do time and time again in a specific situation or similar situations is thought to be indicative of the person you are, the type of personality that you have. Now, we could look at the causes of this, but what lots of behavior, oriented personality psychologists look at is what those behaviors actually indicate about you. How we can use that information to predict what you're going to do from time to time. The big assumption is once we've detected that you're going to do something consistently, we can use that to predict not only what you're going to do in similar encounters, but in ones that we might relate to that particular situation. And to do this, we have to introduce a major term that current personality psychologists are interested in. We call this term traits. You might have used this kind of as a layperson time to time when you're describing yourselves or others. But to personality psychologists, traits is a very essential term or very essential idea that we can use in our attempts to predict this kind of overlap of behaviors across situations. When we're discussing traits, what we're talking about is some type of a characteristic or quality that we can use to describe your consistent behaviors across situations. Now, even though most personality psychologists agree that traits are exceptionally important, one thing that's surprising to a lot of people when they get into personality is the fact that we don't necessarily agree about all the different ideas of how we can measure traits or what we can use to separate people. In fact, for many years, we've had a number of psychologists get into different camps and hotly debate with their colleagues about who's right on this particular topic of traits. This particular idea is what we're going to be discussing in today's class. When we look at traits, though, we have to move ourselves from one particular mode of study that we've talked about thus far in personality psychology into another one. When we look at Freud's early work, some of the work of Jung, and actually a lot of the people that we've discussed thus far, what we see is that most of their personality research and their ideas were based not on large samples of individuals that they were comparing, but instead they got their sources of personality, or I guess their sources of the theories of personality, by looking at very small samples of individuals, looking at them not only for just a second or a minute, but through an extensive amount of exposure. Nowadays, we call this particular approach, the one that was really pioneered by Freud, the idiographic approach. Idiographic is not idiotic. It's simply an extensive amount of study of one particular individual in order to come up with theories about how personality works. Most of our current personality psychologists prefer a different type of approach. They prefer to look at large samples of individuals across numerous situations, but not a huge number of situations, and compare the differences in their behaviors or the perceptions of what they're seeing. When we do that, we're using something nowadays called the nomothetic approach. And this idea of comparing individuals to get at personality is something that lots and lots of people have used in different ways to get their own sense of what personality is like and how we can understand this concept of traits better. When we look at this idea of traits, though, there's one other thing that we have to introduce. And that's the notion that when I'm measuring a person's behaviors, it could be theoretically an internal product of one of two things. Social factors matter, but even if we avoid social factors and look at what's going on inside of you, sometimes we can't attribute a specific behavior to traits. And that's because in the nomothetic approach, what we've found is that there are occasions when people behave in a specific way not in a way that matches up with their consistent behaviors, but instead in a way that matches up with their current experiences or their current feelings. This leads us to really need to distinguish between two particular internal things that can affect us: states and the traits that we talked about. Traits, again, are considered to be very long-lasting, consistent characteristics that we can use to describe a person over time. They're theoretically very uninfluenced by social cues. So if I describe somebody as nice, somebody as hostile, somebody as lazy, these descriptors are meant to indicate what they're going to do across situations regardless of what's going on in the environment. When I talk about states, I'm looking at things that are just temporarily brought up within an individual. So I can make you angry and affect your behavior. I can get you excited and see how that changes what you're doing in a situation. In essence, if a social cue or an environmental factor briefly or temporarily changes who you are, or maybe some memory brings up an old idea or concept that has an impact on us, then this is not what we call a trait. Instead, we call it a state. And as trait psychologists, we need to be very careful in distinguishing the difference in behaviors between states and trait-caused actions. This particular approach is something that's really important and one of the most common debates that we have in the field of personality today. Namely, the major question that many personality psychologists have asked over the years is, how many traits do we actually have? If I want to describe a person, we know, if we look in the English dictionary, that we can come up with thousands of different ways to actually articulate who somebody is. This is not only true for the English dictionary, but in any language. Traits are very, very diverse. But sometimes we don't need all those traits. Sometimes if I want to figure out who you are, I might just need one thing, like the picture to your left indicates. Maybe pessimists, optimists, maybe people that overthink, and just really negative people in general are all we want to look at for determining the differences between individuals. Other psychologists have argued that we need way more than that one particular thing to understand what a person's like, to predict what they're going to do from situation to situation. Over the years, we've grappled with this question of how many traits we have, and more importantly, how many traits we need to predict what a person's going to do from moment to moment. And what we're going to be doing today is discussing how this debate unfolded and where it started. When we discuss where it started, we have to go back pretty much to the same time as George Kelly and look at another researcher that was trying to understand personality from his own view at that time. This particular researcher's name was Gordon Allport. He was born in the Midwest, in particular in Montezuma, Indiana, in 1897. He was on a farm, or born to a farm family, and he was the youngest of 4 boys. And according to his family and his peers, he was described as kind of an unmotivated individual. He didn't like really socializing, he didn't really like going out, he didn't like working in the farm. It's not that he was hateful or anything, he just never really found any affinity for many activities. But there was one thing that he was exceptionally good at, and that was school. In fact, after going through high school, he immediately went to Harvard to get his undergraduate degree. And like many people during his time, the work of Freud attracted him to the field of psychology. In fact, after studying psychology for 4 years at Harvard, he was very motivated and decided to go visit one of his brothers in Vienna, where he also knew Freud was located. And to make this experience more rich, he decided to actually try to meet with Freud one-on-one when he went out to visit his friend. This move was very typical of many psychology students with a lot of money and a lot of motivation at the time, because Freud was, again, the dominant figure in the field of psychology at that time. And in Allport's mind, what he wanted to do was meet the man that essentially had formed the field, come up with his own ideas that have really reshaped psychology at the time, and find a way to actually attend Freud's school in Vienna. So he took a train all the way out to Vienna, and on this train he started realizing that he had no idea what he was going to talk with Freud about when he went to the meeting. So he started searching around, trying to figure out what it was that he could bring up with Freud. And eventually, he settled on something that caught his attention about halfway through the trip. There was this young boy who seemed to have these major issues with cleanliness. He was upset because his fingers kept getting dirty, so he kept having to wash his hands and go check out his face in the bathroom. And this was something that Allport thought Freud might like talking about. So he took down a couple notes, went to Freud, and eventually, in the conversation, after introducing himself, started telling Freud about this young child. And according to Allport, as his conversation continued, Freud got a giant smile on his face, started leaning back, and eventually looked in on Allport and said, "And is this young child you?" And according to Allport, this was the moment that led him to believe that Freud had no idea what he was actually talking about. Essentially, the most important figure in psychology at the time was just full of hot air. And this led him to reject the ideas of Freud and instead decide to start trying to form his own ideas of personality that hadn't been studied in the field at that point. So he went back to Harvard, earned his PhD in 2 years, which for any of you that have any familiarity with PhDs know, that's almost impossible to do. Usually it takes 5 to 6 years for most people, sometimes even more than that. But for him, he earned it in 2 years. And when he decided to leave, he had to give what most PhD students have to give, something called an exit talk, where you introduce your theories and your ideas to some of the more prominent theorists in the field. One of the theorists in his particular talk was Edward Titchener. We talked about earlier, really the founding father of psychology in the United States. And Titchener, along with a number of other faculty members, when they listened to Allport present his idea, were blown away. Not because they were impressed, but they thought he was actually completely lost on his particular concept. In fact, they rejected all of Allport's presentation on his new theory of what he called personality traits. And afterwards, Allport was then treated for a long period of time as a rogue psychologist, somebody studying something that was off the mainstream and not really a part of general psychology. What was this idea that Allport introduced that was so controversial? In essence, Gordon Allport was the first person to talk about the differences between states and traits. Temporary things that, again, affect us just on a moment-to-moment basis, or things that essentially are carried over across different situations and over time. In Allport's mind, he argued, as you see in the picture below, that if we look at a behavior of an individual, we want to be sure that that behavior is not just indicative of the moment, but instead indicative of the person as a whole. So what we should do is expose them to similar situations over and over again. And if they display the exact same behavior, as you see on the left, in that situation or similar ones, then we can assume that that's part of a person's trait. If, however, they're flip-flopping between different reactions, sometimes they're displaying one reaction and other times they're displaying another, like the picture on the right, then we can assume that that's not indicative of a trait, but instead a part of a person's state. After discussing these differences, Allport then went on to say that we actually have 3 different types of traits that are very important. He said most of the time when we're thinking of individuals and describing them as a specific type of person, we're referencing what's called central traits, characteristics and prominent behaviors that really dominate a person's life. He said most people have a number of central traits that we can look at. But he said in addition to having these central traits, we also have something called secondary dispositions. Traits that don't necessarily pop up on a regular basis, but can still prominently occur if the right situation arises. So maybe some of us aren't considered exceptionally aggressive. In fact, we don't pick fights with people on a regular basis. But when a loved one is in danger or possibly going to get harmed, we may become extremely aggressive. That consistency would imply that it's a trait, but because it's so unbelievably rare, we shouldn't call it a central trait, but instead just a secondary disposition. He said these two things, central traits and secondary dispositions, make up the majority of what a person is. But he argued that there are some individuals within the world that shouldn't actually be defined as a person that has central traits and secondary dispositions. Instead, he argued that there were some people in the world that were just dominated by one particular trait or one particular characteristic. And that this trait was so invasive that it meddled or it kind of impacted every single behavior that a person displayed. So an example of this would be somebody like, say, Mother Teresa, who I'm sure had different characteristics to her other than her giving and her kindness. But when we think of her, we certainly don't think of, say, her bathing habits or whether or not she kept her room tidy. It's this generous giving characteristic that's really the most important and prominent thing that we can use to describe who she is. And in all honesty, if we want to predict what she was doing, that would be the only thing we need to pay attention to. This idea of states and traits, again, was what got Allport in a lot of trouble. But in addition to introducing this idea, he added some other stuff to it that kind of threw him into even a deeper pot, but also in the long run encouraged us to start studying this concept of traits a little bit more closely. In Allport's mind, what we had was the ability to compare individuals across any factor that we were interested in. Namely, one person might have one trait, and that trait might not manifest itself in another person. This idea of having to pick and choose traits from person to person really rubbed a lot of researchers in the field of personality wrong, because they argued that if we are going to try to use this new nomothetic approach, try to understand lots of people, we shouldn't be just picking random traits or characteristics and ascribe them to individuals really at will. And one of the researchers that was kind of bothered by this particular idea was a man named Raymond Cattell. Cattell was kind of the opposite of Allport as a young child. So when he was growing up, he was described as extremely motivated, somewhat popular, but also somewhat, I guess the word would be pompous. For those of you that aren't familiar with that word, think of this individual as very, very self-assured, very certain of his abilities, even to a point where he's overconfident in who he is. And this primarily came from his upbringing. In his family, each night he would sit down at the table with his mother and father and have what they called dinner conversations, where they would try to solve the problems of the world through just logical arguments. And this usually was encouraged by his father, but more often than not, it was kind of led by his mother, who was an exceptionally smart individual. In fact, at some point in time, Cattell's parents both took IQ tests, and his father scored in the upper 3% of the population, and his mother scored in the upper 0.1% of the population, both being indicating that they were very, very intelligent individuals. In his life, he decided that he wanted to get into the field of chemistry. In fact, he had this grand scheme of helping agriculture and the world around us just become better through some of the things that he had discovered. Again, pompous would be one of the better ways to describe Cattell. But eventually, he decided to get into the field of psychology because he saw it as a real budding science, and he saw an appeal to this concept that Allport had introduced. But in his mind, what he was thinking he could do is apply some of the more scientific and mathematical ideas and concepts to this new concept of traits. So he started applying math, in particular a very famous technique now called factor analyses, and mathematical approaches, actually research done by a researcher named Charles Spearman, who, if any of you have statistics later, we'll learn about him a little later on, not in this class, but somewhere down the road. He applied the works of Spearman and some other individuals to come up with a really, really interesting idea of how we might be able to define individuals, not on a person-to-person basis, but on a very consistent basis that we could apply to everybody. This idea allowed him to create more publications than almost any person in the field of psychology to date. In fact, by the time he was done, he had written over 500 research articles, 40 books, and developed, I believe the end number was around 80 or 90 personality tests that we could use. Now, most of them were just derivations of his original personality test, but nonetheless, each time he would create one, he would make more money and get more fame for the different derivations of this particular test. This approach by Cattell led him to come up with a very, very interesting concept about how we could differentiate individuals. In essence, what Cattell argued was that when we're looking at individuals, what we should be able to do is define that person's traits in two different ways. We should look for what's called surface traits, things that we can easily identify in an individual. But we should also look for something called source traits, traits that might overlap and kind of be condensed into one that we shouldn't be able to recognize on the surface. So what Cattell did in his research was he started off by finding a lot of different terms and words that people could use to describe others, and he looked for ones that kind of overlapped, or ones that we often used in our common language. After doing this, he arrived at the notion that we probably had 40 different surface traits, things that we could use to describe individuals across situations and really for everybody involved. But after doing that, what he then did is he asked people to describe themselves on these 40 surface traits. And he did this factor analysis technique where he was able to whittle this list of surface traits down to 16 source traits. Now, a factor analysis is a very complex idea, but in essence, what you do in a factor analysis is you look at a large sample of individuals, say 4 or 5 people. It would be a very small number, but let's say you look at 4 or 5 people on a specific trait. And you want to compare that trait to another one. So you look at one person, we'll call him Bob, and Bob happens to be very high on one particular trait. We look through the list of other traits and we see, lo and behold, that Bob is really high in another trait. Then we go to George. George happens to be in the middle on this second trait. So we go to the same trait that Bob was high on both of, and we look at George, and lo and behold, we find George was in the middle on that next trait. And we find Susan, who happened to be low on the first, and find, again, Susan was low on the second. Well, if we find this for a large number of individuals, many, many more than 3, what we can start to assume is that even if on the surface we can't see how these things overlap, statistically, they seem to have a high match. This was the general idea of a factor analysis. Now, never in his research did he find any traits that were perfectly overlapped, where everybody was on the exact same spot when describing the two traits. But if he found enough people that had this amount of overlap, he thought we could assume, and most people do nowadays agree with him, that we could assume that those two things comprised of just one specific trait. That's how he was able to get those surface traits of 40 down to 16. Again, sort of. How did he do this? Or I guess what did he come up with out of this? Well, we now call these traits the 16PF. The 16 personality factors displayed by Cattell are often broken down into different factors. So the first factors he had were A, B, C, E, F, and G: warmth, reasoning, emotional stability, dominance, liveliness, and rule conscientiousness. All of these were found through questionnaires that he would ask people to rate themselves on. The other ones that he found through these questionnaires that people were asked to rate themselves on were factors H, I, L, M, N, and O: social boldness, sensitivity, vigilance, abstractness, privateness, and apprehension. Again, when asking people to describe themselves, these were the ones that emerged. But if you count them up, you'll quickly recognize that's only 12 factors. And that's because in Cattell's research, in addition to asking about people describing themselves, he wanted to figure out if people could possibly describe others and come up with different factors. So in a second set of studies, he would ask people to describe loved ones. And when he had people describe loved ones, some of those original factors emerged, but 4 additional ones started to pop up. This idea of openness to change, self-reliance, perfectionism, and tension, things that people often didn't use to describe themselves, came out in the factor analyses that he did. So when we talk about Cattell's 16 personality factors, what we actually see is that it's a combination of different tests. In reality, I think Cattell came up with about 14 personality factors when asking people to describe themselves, and 16 or 17 when describing others. So he just kind of merged them into something that looked good and listed them as a 16 PF. Ironically, lots of people now think that even though he seemed to be very scientific in his attempts, a lot of his final approaches and his final touches seem to just be arbitrary. But regardless of whether or not we agree with Cattell's 16 factors, which I need to stress to you now, you do not have to memorize for the test. It's merely an idea of how he got it that I want you to get. Regardless of how he actually obtained these 60 personality factors, though, the big thing that we got from him was the notion that what we might be able to do is just have one term that we can ascribe to everybody for a specific trait, another term that we can ascribe to everybody for a specific trait, and so on, instead of having to come up with arbitrary individual definitions of what a person was like. This notion, this idea, was picked up on by other researchers.